Hello friends, and welcome to the Lost Ghastly Journal. Tonight, we're journeying back to a sweltering summer in late 19th century America, to a place where old money and new industry collided, and where one morning would unleash a horror so profound it would ripple through history and remain shrouded in mystery for over a century. On the morning of August 4th, 1892, a shocking and brutal crime took place inside a seemingly respectable home on 2nd Street in Fall River, Massachusetts. In a single, horrific act, 2 individuals were savagely slain with a small axe, one victim enduring 19 blows, the other 11. For over an hour, the killer moved silently through the house, a ghost in plain sight, waiting, watching, and meticulously plotting the unthinkable. Despite a massive manhunt and a sensational trial that captivated the nation, the identity of the true murderer was never definitively established. The events that unfolded in that stifling summer heat would force a community to confront the dark secrets lurking behind closed doors. Secrets that challenged all notions of family loyalty and human decency. Before we delve into the tragic story of the Hennessy family and their Irish maid, Bridget Omali, who would become the only witness to the horror, be sure to hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We want to know where our fellow mystery enthusiasts are gathered tonight. Now, let's go back to a time when Fall River was still reeling from the wounds of industrialization, a time when a morning of violence shattered the carefully constructed illusion of safety an entire community had built around itself. Fall River, in the summer of 1892, was a city caught between 2 starkly different worlds. The old Yankee families, whose wealth was built on whaling and maritime trade, now watched with unease as the city's skyline was choked with the smoke-belching chimneys of textile mills. They called it Spindle City, a place where French-Canadian and Irish immigrants toiled in suffocating conditions for 16 hours a day, their children's future measured in lint and lost fingers. The Hennessy house on 2nd Street stood as a stubborn monument to the old guard's resistance to change. Andrew Hennessy had made his fortune the traditional way, starting in the coffin business, a grim irony that would later echo in every news report of his death. By 1892, he was a man of considerable wealth and power, owning rental properties, holding directorships in the mills, and commanding respect through fear rather than affection. At 70 years old, his gaunt frame and piercing gray eyes were enough to make grown men stammer when they came to pay their rent. His wife Abby was his second marriage, a practical arrangement that had endured for 27 years, without ever blooming into genuine love. She was a broad-shouldered woman of 64 with tightly pulled gray hair, a detail that the Irish maid, Bridget Omali, noticed with the careful deference of someone who understood her place in a world of rigid social hierarchies. She had become an expert at navigating the peculiar tensions between Mr. Hennessy and his daughters from his first marriage. Lizzy Hennessy, a 32-year-old unmarried woman, possessed a sharp, restless intelligence that made others uncomfortable. She was a voracious reader, openly expressed her opinions at church, and held views on women's suffrage that her father considered highly inappropriate. Her older sister, Emma, was a 41-year-old spinster by the standards of the day, who had long ago retreated into a shell of bitter resignation. The sisters had never accepted Abby as their mother, addressing her only as Mrs. Hennessy for nearly 3 decades, a calculated campaign of exclusion that had slowly poisoned the atmosphere of the house. Bridget had been a silent witness to it all. She saw how conversations would stop abruptly when Abby entered a room, how Emma and Lizzie would exchange knowing glances, and she felt the oppressive weight of the secrets that seemed to cling to the walls like the summer humidity.
The summer of 1892 had been particularly brutal. The mill workers were restless, and whispers of strikes and labor organizers filled the air. The Hennessy family, despite their wealth, felt the pressure from all sides. Financial uncertainty from fluctuating textile markets, social tension as the old guard was outnumbered by immigrants, and the constant simmering friction within their own home. In the weeks leading up to August 4th, that friction had erupted into something far more dangerous. The family arguments became more frequent and more vicious. Lizzie had been heard shouting at her father about money, his will, and property she believed should rightfully belong to her and Emma. Neighbors later recalled seeing lights burning late into the night, hearing raised voices thick with the kind of anger that could carry through thin walls. Bridget, despite her efforts to remain invisible, knew about the turmoil. She had learned that Mr. Hennessy had recently changed his will and was discussing property transfers that would leave his daughters with less than they expected. She knew of Emma's venomous resentment toward Abby and Lizzie's increasingly erratic behavior. She saw conversations halt in her presence, felt the unspoken accusations in the air. What she didn't know was how close they all were to a breaking point that would turn their private grievances into a public horror. The morning of August 4th dawned hot and thick with a suffocating humidity that made tempers flare without warning. As always, Bridget was up before dawn, stoking the kitchen fire and preparing breakfast for a family that rarely ate together anymore. The tension in the house was so palpable you could taste it, a bitter, metallic flavor like blood. John Desmond, Abby's brother-in-law, had arrived unexpectedly the night before. A gaunt man with nervous hands and restless eyes, he claimed to be in Fall River on business, but Bridget had overheard enough whispered conversations to know his visit was tied to property deals and family money. His presence added another layer of stress to an already volatile situation. At breakfast, the family gathered for what would be their last meal together. Mr. Hennessy sat at the head of the table, reading his newspaper with the deliberate silence of a man asserting his authority. Abby served weak coffee and day-old bread, her movements subdued. Desmond nervously picked at his food, occasionally glancing toward the stairs where Lizzie remained in her room. She's been acting strange lately, asking questions about money, about the will. Yesterday I caught her going through Andrew's papers in his study. Desmond nodded grimly. Property disputes can tear a family apart. I've seen it happen before. When Lizzie finally appeared, her pale face was flushed with an emotion Bridget couldn't quite identify. It was anger, yes, but also something else, something that made the Irish girl's hands tremble as she cleared the dishes. Lizzie's dark eyes swept the room with the intensity of someone memorizing details for future use. The conversation was stilted, loaded with unspoken undercurrents about property on the South Side, rental income, and decisions that needed to be made. Mr. Hennessy's voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, and Abby nodded in agreement. Lizzie said nothing, but her silence was more ominous than any argument. Around 9 o'clock, Desmond announced his intention to visit relatives across town, promising to return that evening to conclude his business with Mr. Hennessy. As he gathered his coat and hat, Bridget noticed his hands shaking, his eyes avoiding Lizzie's intense stare. 20 minutes later, Mr. Hennessy left for his morning rounds, conducting the business that insulated his family from the struggles of working-class Fall River. He gave Abby a perfunctory kiss on the cheek and reminded Bridget to wash the outside windows, a task that would occupy her for most of the morning. That left 3 women alone in the house: Abby, Lizzie, and Bridget. One of them would be dead within an hour.
Bridget was struggling with the heavy windows on the east side of the house when she heard the first scream. It was brief and cut off abruptly, but it was unmistakably human. She paused, brushed the soapy water from her hands, and listened. Nothing. The street was quiet, except for the distant clatter of a milk wagon. She resumed washing, but her movements were less confident now.
There was a quality to that scream, not of surprise, but of genuine terror that made her stomach clench with primitive fear. When the second scream came, longer and more desperate, Bridget dropped her brush entirely. It was coming from inside the house, from upstairs, from the guest room where Abby had been making beds after Desmond's visit. The screaming stopped again, but this time the silence was far worse than the sound. Her Protestant upbringing had taught her that curiosity was a sin, but 3 years in the Hennessy household had taught her that ignoring potential disasters could cost her her job. Wiping her hands on her apron, she approached the back door, listening carefully. Nothing. She climbed the back stairs slowly, her footsteps muffled by the carpet runner that Mrs. Hennessy had installed to keep the house quiet. The hallway at the top of the stairs was shadowy in the morning light that filtered through the lace curtains. The guest room door was slightly ajar. "Mrs. Hennessy? Ma'am, are you all right?" Bridget called out softly. No answer. She pushed the door open wider and stepped into a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Abby Hennessy lay face down on the floor beside the bed, her gray dress dark with blood. Her head was a ruin of bone and brain matter, a grotesque mess from repeated blows with something heavy and sharp. Blood had sprayed across the floral wallpaper in a pattern that would have been almost decorative had it not been so horrifying. But it was the smell that made Bridget's knees buckle. Metallic, sweet, overwhelmingly organic. The smell of a slaughterhouse, of humanity reduced to meat. And standing in the corner of the room, still holding the small axe that had done the work, was Lizzie. Her white shirtwaist was pristine, unstained. Her dark hair was perfectly arranged, but her eyes held an expression Bridget would later struggle to describe to investigators. It wasn't madness, but a kind of cold satisfaction, as if she had just completed a necessary but unpleasant task. "She fell," Lizzie said calmly, as if commenting on the weather. "Poor dear, she must have slipped." Bridget looked at the axe in Lizzie's hands, at the devastation on the floor, at the blood on the walls. She opened her mouth to scream, to run, to do something, but Lizzie's voice stopped her. "You're going to help me, Bridget, because if you don't, they'll say you did this. An Irish girl with no family, no connections, no one to speak for her. Who do you think they'll believe?" The words hit Bridget like physical blows. She was 25 years old, 3,000 miles from home, alone in a country that viewed Irish immigrants as inherently criminal. She had seen what happened to Irish girls who crossed their employers. They disappeared into police cells or poverty, and no one asked questions. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered.
Lizzie smiled. And in that smile, Bridget glimpsed something far more terrifying than anger or madness. It was pure calculation. This was a woman who had planned not just murder, but its aftermath. The next hour passed with the surreal quality of a fever dream. Lizzie cleaned the axe methodically in the wash basin, her movements as precise as a surgeon's. She changed her dress, bundling the blood-stained clothing into a laundry bag that she hid in the cellar. She repositioned Abby's body to make the wounds less obvious from the doorway, then closed the guest room door and locked it. Bridget watched all of this in a numbed silence, paralyzed by the realization that she was now an accomplice. Every moment she remained silent made her more guilty, more trapped, more dependent on Lizzie's version of events. "You must understand," Lizzie said, washing her hands with the thoroughness of Lady Macbeth. "I had no choice. She was going to destroy everything, take Father's money, leave Emma and me with nothing. She was poison in this house, Bridget. You've seen how she manipulated him, how she turned him against his own blood." The justification rolled off Lizzie's tongue with the practiced fluency of someone who had rehearsed it many times. But Bridget noticed how Lizzie's hands continued to shake even after they were clean, and her eyes darted constantly toward the locked guest room door. At 11 o'clock, they heard Mr. Hennessy's key in the front door. "Remember," Lizzie whispered, her fingers digging into Bridget's arm with surprising strength. "She went out to visit a sick friend. She received a note this morning. You saw the messenger bring it." Bridget nodded, though she had seen no messenger, no note. The lie felt heavy on her tongue, but the alternative, being charged with murder in a system that had already decided Irish girls were guilty of something, felt heavier still. Mr. Hennessy entered the house, calling for Abby to help him with his coat. Receiving no answer, he settled into his favorite chair in the sitting room, exhausted by the morning's heat. "Where is Mrs. Hennessy?" he asked Lizzie, who had appeared in the doorway with an expression of mild concern. "She received a note about Mrs. Churchill being ill," Lizzie replied smoothly. "She left about an hour ago, said she might not be back until this evening." Mr. Hennessy grunted his acceptance and closed his eyes. Within minutes, the regular rise and fall of his chest indicated he had fallen into the deep sleep of an elderly man on a hot day. Lizzie watched him for several long minutes, her face expressionless. Then she turned to Bridget and nodded toward the kitchen. "I'm going upstairs to rest," she announced loudly enough for her father to hear. "The heat is making me feel faint." But instead of going to her room, Lizzie retrieved the axe from where she had hidden it behind the cellar door. Bridget wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to stop what was about to happen, but her feet felt rooted to the kitchen floor, and her voice had abandoned her entirely. She could only watch as Lizzie walked quietly back toward the sitting room, the axe hidden in the folds of her clean dress. The first blow caught Mr. Hennessy just above the left temple as he slept. His eyes snapped open in surprise and pain, but there was no time for him to comprehend what was happening. The second blow split his forehead down to the eye socket. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth blows obliterated the left side of his face entirely. By the time Lizzie was finished, Andrew Hennessy's head was a crater of bone and blood, and his daughter was standing over him with the same cold satisfaction she had displayed upstairs. This time, however, she was breathing hard. Now we scream, we discover the body, we call for help, and we never speak of what really happened here. The performance that followed was masterful. Lizzie's screams brought neighbors running from 3 houses away. Her sobbing collapse in the front yard convinced everyone that she was as much a victim as the dead man in the sitting room. Even the family doctor was moved by her apparent grief. But Bridget noticed things that the others missed. Her tears never quite reached her eyes. She recovered her composure remarkably quickly when she thought no one was watching. Most disturbingly of all, she seemed to anticipate the questions the police would ask, as if she had prepared for this interrogation. When investigators discovered Abby's body upstairs, Lizzie's shock seemed genuine enough to fool everyone, except the Irish girl who had witnessed the truth. The official narrative began to form immediately. An unknown intruder had somehow entered the house, committed 2 brutal murders, and escaped without being seen. It was a convenient story, one that allowed Fall River's respectable citizens to sleep soundly, secure in the belief that evil was an external force, not something that festered within their own families. But Bridget knew better, and as the investigation intensified, she began to understand that her knowledge made her a target. Detective Mallory, a methodical man brought in from Boston, was assigned to lead the investigation. Within 48 hours, he had identified several red flags that suggested the killer was intimately familiar with the Hennessy household. There was no sign of forced entry. The timing of the murders was highly suspicious. Abby had been killed 90 minutes before her husband, yet no one had seen a stranger enter or leave the house. Most damning of all, the murder weapon, the family axe, belonged to the Hennessys. An intruder would have had to have been extraordinarily familiar with the house's layout to find it so quickly and quietly. But Detective Mallory's investigation faced obstacles that had nothing to do with evidence. The establishment of Fall River was deeply uncomfortable with the possibility that one of their own might be capable of such violence. The Hennessys were wealthy, respectable, and Protestant, pillars of the community. To suggest that Lizzie might have murdered her parents was to question the fundamental assumptions of the city's social order. The pressure to find an external culprit was enormous. Police arrested several Portuguese immigrants on flimsy pretexts and held Irish laborers for questioning without cause. Bridget found herself caught in the middle. As an Irish domestic servant, she was at the lowest rung of Fall River's social hierarchy. Her testimony was treated with suspicion, not because it was inconsistent, but because it came from someone whose word was considered inherently unreliable. During her initial interviews, Bridget stuck to the story Lizzie had concocted. Abby had left to visit a friend, Mr. Hennessy had come home for a nap, and both women had been in different parts of the house when the murders occurred. She described hearing strange noises and finding the bodies. But Detective Mallory was experienced enough to know when witnesses were holding back. He noticed how Bridget's hands trembled when she described finding Abby's body, how her voice dropped to a whisper when discussing Lizzie's whereabouts, and how she seemed to be reciting rehearsed answers rather than recalling actual events. "There's something you're not telling me," he said during their third interview, his voice gentle but insistent. "I understand you're frightened, but if you know something that might help us patch the person who did this, you have a moral obligation to speak." Bridget met his eyes for a moment, and the detective saw a look of hopeless resignation. The truth, she understood, was more dangerous than any lie. "I've told you everything I know," she said quietly. "I didn't see anything." The detective didn't believe her, but he also understood that he couldn't force her. In 1892, an immigrant domestic servant could be fired, blacklisted, or even deported if she made the wrong enemies. As the investigation dragged on, the focus gradually shifted toward Lizzie herself. Her behavior after the murders was described as too controlled, too calculating for a grieving daughter. Other details emerged. Several druggists in Fall River reported that a woman matching Lizzie's description had attempted to purchase a deadly poison called prussic acid the day before the murders. More damaging still was the testimony of a family friend who claimed to have seen Lizzie burning a dress in the kitchen stove just 3 days after the killings. When questioned, Lizzie said the dress was stained with paint, but investigators found no evidence of it in the stove. The destruction of potentially blood-stained clothing looked less like housekeeping and more like evidence tampering. The break in the case came from John Desmond, the brother-in-law. Initially, he had provided Lizzie with an alibi, but as public scrutiny intensified, he became increasingly nervous. In a follow-up interview, he revealed a heated argument he had overheard Lizzie and her father the night before the murders. "She was angrier than I'd ever seen her," Desmond told the detective. "She said something about not letting Abby steal what belonged to her and Emma, said she'd see them all dead before she'd let that happen." The statement was damning, but it was still circumstantial. What Detective Mallory needed was direct evidence, or a witness willing to testify about what had really happened. He was beginning to suspect he already had such a witness. The question was whether Bridget Omali would find the courage to tell the truth before it was too late.
By early September, the investigation had reached a critical point. Detective Mallory had enough circumstantial evidence to arrest Lizzie, but he knew that such cases were difficult to prosecute, especially when the defendant was a wealthy white woman. The only realistic option was to convince Bridget to break her silence. The pressure on Bridget had been mounting steadily. She continued to work for Lizzie and Emma, but the atmosphere in the house was suffocating. Lizzie watched her constantly, monitoring her conversations with investigators and subtly threatening her. "You understand your position here, don't you?" Lizzie said one evening. "You're part of this family now. What affects us affects you. If our reputation is damaged, you'll suffer the consequences." The message was clear. Bridget's survival depended on maintaining the fiction they had constructed. But Detective Mallory was equally persistent. He interviewed Bridget regularly, always probing for inconsistencies.
During one such interview, he tried a different approach. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said. "You're young, intelligent, hardworking. You could have a good life in America. But you're never going to have that life if you're connected to this family." He leaned forward, his voice more urgent. "Lizzy Hennessy killed her parents, didn't she? And you saw her do it." For a moment, Bridget's carefully constructed facade cracked. The detective saw the flash of truth in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. But then the mask slammed back into place. "No, sir," she said firmly. "I told you what happened. I was outside washing windows. I didn't see anything." Mallory studied her face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right, but if you change your mind, you know where to find me. And Bridget, when this comes to trial, you're going to be the key witness. Think carefully about which version of events you want to be remembered for." That night, Bridget lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around her. She thought about the detective's words, about the life she might have if she found the courage to speak the truth. But she also thought about what would happen if she accused Lizzy and the jury didn't believe her. The decision was made for her 3 days later. Bridget was dusting the front parlor when she overheard Lizzy and Emma talking upstairs. "The detective is getting too close," Emma was saying, "and that Irish girl is weak. I can see it in her eyes." "Lizzy won't talk," Lizzy replied confidently. "She's too frightened. And even if she did, who would believe her? The word of an Irish domestic against ours." "But what if they do believe her?" Emma insisted. "What if she tells them what really happened?" There was a long pause. When Lizzy spoke again, her voice carried a chill that made Bridget's blood run cold. "Then we'll have to make sure she can't tell anyone anything." Bridget had heard enough. She finished her dusting with trembling hands, her mind racing. That evening, she went to Detective Mallory's boarding house and asked to speak with him privately. "I need to tell you something," she said, her Irish accent thicker than usual, "about what really happened that morning, about what I really saw." Bridget's confession, delivered over the next 2 hours, would form the foundation of the prosecution's case against Lizzy Hennessy. But as she unburdened herself of the secret that had been eating away at her conscience, she and the detective had no idea that Lizzy was far more resourceful and ruthless than they had imagined. The game was far from over.
The trial of Lizzy Hennessy for the murders of her father and stepmother began on June 5, 1893, in New Bedford, Massachusetts. The case had become a national sensation, with reporters from across the country covering every detail. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators, reporters, and curiosity seekers. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Harrison Knowlton, built their case methodically around Bridget Omali's testimony and the circumstantial evidence Detective Mallory had assembled. They painted a picture of a calculating woman who murdered her parents for financial gain, using her intimate knowledge of the house to commit the perfect crime. Bridget's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case, speaking in a clear, steady voice despite the hostile stares from the defense table. She described in horrific detail what she had witnessed. "I saw Miss Lizzy standing over Mrs. Hennessy's body," she told the hushed courtroom. "She was holding the axe, and there was blood everywhere. When she saw me, she said that Mrs. Hennessy had fallen, but I could see what had really happened." The defense attorney, George Robinson, a former governor and one of the most skilled criminal lawyers in New England, attacked Bridget's credibility relentlessly. He emphasized her status as an Irish immigrant, suggested her testimony was motivated by jealousy, and highlighted the inconsistencies between her trial testimony and her initial statements to police.
The prosecution would have you convict a respectable American woman on the word of a foreign domestic who has already admitted to lying, Robinson declared in his opening statement. This is not justice. This is scapegoating of the worst kind. But the prosecution had more than just Bridget's testimony. They presented evidence of Lizzie's attempt to purchase poison, her suspicious behavior after the killings, and the burned dress. They called financial experts to establish the inheritance motive, and character witnesses who painted a picture of a dysfunctional family torn apart by greed. The defense strategy was masterful in its simplicity. They argued that a respectable woman like Lizzy Hennessy was simply incapable of such brutality. Victorian gender stereotypes worked in their favor. The idea that a well-bred lady could wield an axe with enough force to shatter skulls was almost unthinkable to the all-male jury. Robinson also skillfully exploited the anti-Irish prejudices of the era, suggesting that Bridget herself might have committed the murders. The most dramatic moment came when Lizzie herself took the stand against her lawyer's advice, confident in her ability to convince the jury of her innocence. Her performance was masterful. She spoke softly, wept when describing her love for her parents, and maintained her innocence with such conviction that even some reporters found themselves questioning her guilt. However, under cross-examination, cracks began to appear in Lizzie's facade. District Attorney Knowlton was
relentless, forcing her to explain the contradictions in her story, the suspicious timing of her actions, and her knowledge of details only the killer could have known. "Miss Hennessy," Knowlton said, his voice sharp with prosecutorial precision, "do you remember attempting to purchase prussic acid from Smith's drugstore on August 3rd? "No, I do not." "You don't remember? Or it didn't happen?" "It didn't happen." Knowlton then produced a signed statement from the clerk at the drugstore, who positively identified Lizzie as the woman who attempted to purchase the poison. Lizzie's composure finally cracked. Her face flushed red, and her voice rose to a hysterical pitch. "How dare you question my character? I am a Christian woman," she screamed. But the damage was done. The jury had seen behind the mask, and what they found was not the grieving daughter she had portrayed, but something much darker. The moment that sealed Lizzie's fate came when Knowlton produced the most damning piece of evidence, a letter Bridget had written to her sister in Ireland 3 weeks after the murders. The letter had been intercepted by postal inspectors and contained details Bridget had never shared with investigators, details that could have only come from a first-hand witness. "I cannot sleep at night for the terrible thing I have seen," the letter read. "She killed them both, Mary. I saw her do it with my own eyes. When it was over, she looked at me with such cold eyes and said I would hang for it if I ever told." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Realizing his case was collapsing, defense attorney Robinson requested a private conference with Lizzie and her sister Emma. What was said was never officially recorded, but a court stenographer later claimed to have overheard fragments of a heated conversation. According to her, Emma Hennessy finally broke under the pressure and admitted to the lawyer that she had suspected Lizzie's guilt from the beginning. "She's always been capable of violence when she doesn't get her way," Emma allegedly said. "I tried to protect her, but I can't watch her destroy that poor Irish girl to save herself." When the trial resumed, the defense's strategy had completely changed. Robinson no longer argued for Lizzie's innocence, but for diminished capacity, suggesting his client was suffering from temporary insanity. It was too little, too late. On June 20th, 1893, after deliberating for just over 2 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of murder in the first degree. But even as the verdict was read, Lizzie maintained her innocence with a conviction that was almost supernatural in its intensity. As the bailiffs approached, she turned to face the packed courtroom. "I am innocent of these charges," she declared, "and someday, when the truth is finally known, you will all understand the terrible mistake you have made here today." Some would later claim her words were prophetic, but others saw only the final performance of a calculating killer who had been caught at last.
Lizzy Hennessy was sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence was considered merciful, as many had expected the death penalty. But the jury had been influenced by the gender prejudices of the era. The idea of executing a woman, even one guilty of parricide, struck them as barbaric. The trial's aftermath revealed the true cost of the investigation. Bridget Omali, despite her crucial testimony, found herself unemployable in Fall River. The Irish community viewed her as a traitor who had betrayed her employer, while the Yankee establishment saw her as an outsider who had brought a scandal to their city. Within 6 months, she had left Massachusetts, moving west to Montana to start a new life. Emma Hennessy suffered a complete nervous breakdown and was committed to a sanitarium where she would spend the rest of her life. Detective Mallory, despite solving one of the most sensational cases of his career, retired from police work within a year, his faith in human nature shattered. The Hennessy house stood empty for years, haunted by local legends of strange sounds and unexplained lights. When it was finally sold and renovated, the new owners tore out walls and floors, painting over any evidence of the violence that had occurred there. But some stains, as they say, run deeper than paint can cover. In 1918, 25 years after the trial, a remarkable document surfaced that cast a new light on the murders. A trunk found in Emma Hennessy's belongings after her death contained her private journal, which detailed a confession that contradicted much of what had been established at trial. According to Emma's journal, she and Lizzy had planned the murders together over several months. The motive was not just financial, it was also deeply personal. Emma claimed her father had been sexually abusing Lizzy for years, and her stepmother had not only known about it, but had actively covered it up. "We had no choice," Emma wrote. "The law would not have protected us. We were trapped in that house with monsters, and the only way to escape was to become monsters ourselves." The journal also revealed that the sisters had originally planned to poison their parents, which explained Lizzie's attempt to purchase prussic acid. Most shockingly, Emma claimed that Bridget Omali had not witnessed the murders at all. She had arrived on the scene after both parents were dead and had been coerced into lying about what she had seen. "Poor Bridget," Emma wrote. "We destroyed her life to save our own. I pray that someday she will forgive us for what we made her do." The revelation of Emma's journal created a sensation, but by then, most of the principal figures in the case were dead. Lizzy had died in prison, still maintaining her innocence. Bridget had disappeared into the anonymity of the American West. Mallory had passed away, taking his suspicions to his grave. The journal raised more questions than it answered. If Emma's account was true, then the trial had resulted in a just verdict, but it was reached through false testimony. If it was false, then an innocent woman had been executed for crimes she didn't commit. The truth died with the last of the participants. In 1975, a reporter discovered that Bridget Omali had indeed survived to old age, living under an assumed name in a small Montana town. She had married and lived a seemingly normal life, but according to neighbors, she never spoke about her past and would become visibly distressed whenever anyone mentioned Fall River or the year 1892. Bridget died in 1948, taking with her her secrets to the grave. Her death certificate listed her cause of death as natural, but her pastor noted in his diary that her final words were, "I never told a single untruth at that trial. God help me, but I never told a single untruth." Was that a confession or a denial? No one could say for certain. The Hennessy murders remain officially solved, the case closed in the files of the Fall River Police Department. But for those who study the evidence, who examine the contradictions and inconsistencies that peppered the investigation, one question remains unanswered. In a case where everyone had a reason to lie, where social prejudices distorted the pursuit of justice, and where the truth was considered less important than maintaining the illusion of social order, how can we ever truly know what happened in that sweltering house on an August morning more than a century ago? The answer, perhaps, is that we can't. And maybe that's exactly what someone wanted all along. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Fall River intensifies. If this story has given you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what secrets still lie buried in the shadows of American history. This mystery shows us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that live within our own families, hiding behind masks of respectability and social standing. The Hennessy murders remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes. Sometimes it comes wearing the face of someone we trust, someone we love, someone we would never suspect. What do you think? Was Lizzie guilty, or was she a victim of circumstances and prejudice? Do you think Bridget Omali told the truth, or was she coerced into a lie that destroyed multiple lives? Leave your comment below and let us know your theory. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do. The shadows of the past are long, and sometimes they reach into the present in ways we never expect. Until next time, sleep well if you can.